This video is going to give you a basic understanding of everything you need to know to read almost any rhythm. And even if you're not remotely interested in reading sheet music, you should still know how to read rhythms because it's going to give you a great understanding of how rhythm works, and it's going to allow you to learn songs much faster. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to talk about is something called subdivisions of two. So rhythm is all about essentially taking time and dividing it into different subdivisions. And the first subdivision we're going to talk about is called quarter notes. And this is the most basic subdivision. This is what a quarter note looks like. And they're counted by just clapping or playing one beat at a time, like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So in most music, the quarter note equals one beat. Next is the half note. The half note is a longer note, and then half note lasts for 2 beats. So it's the same length as 2 quarter notes, but we hold out the note for that entire time. So if I clapped half notes, it would sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Up next, we have whole notes. Whole notes are super simple. They're just even longer notes. A whole note takes up the space of 2 half notes or the space of 4 quarter notes. So if I play whole notes, it sounds like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So quarter notes, half notes, and whole notes are the super duper basic subdivisions that you need to know, but there's a couple more that we're going to cover in this video. The first one is eighth notes. So in the name, it's implied eighth notes because it takes up 1/8 of a measure, and an eighth is a half of a quarter note. So a quarter note actually takes up the space of 2 eighth notes. And the way that we count eighth notes is a little bit different than the way that we've counted all the other subdivisions before, which is just using one beat at a time. Instead, now that we're splitting one beat, which is a quarter note, into 2 parts, we're going to count it like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And then finally, we can divide eighth notes one more time and create 16th notes. 16 16th notes fit into a measure music, and 4 16th notes fit into the space of 1 quarter note. The way that we count 16th notes is like this. 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a. Okay, now let's talk about time signature. A time signature is actually one of the most important things in any piece of music because it tells you exactly how we are going to count and how we're going to think of all the subdivisions that I just talked about. So the most common time signature is called 4/4. And it's actually also referred to as common time because literally almost every single song is in 4/4 time. Not every single song, but almost every song. So when we look at the time signature, the top number means how many beats are going to be in a measure, and then the bottom number indicates what kind of note is assigned one beat. So in 4/4 time, the top number is 4, which means there's going to be 4 beats in the measure, and the bottom number is 4, which means that a quarter note equals 1 beat. There's also many different kinds of time signatures like 6/8. So 6/8 means that there are 6 beats in the measure, and 8 is on the bottom, so that actually means that eighth notes are counted as 1 beat in that case. There's also something called odd time signatures, which are things like 5/8, 7/4, 5/16, all kinds of crazy things. They are very uncommon, but you should still be familiar with them because you can still see them. And actually, some odd time signatures are found in many popular songs. For example, like Pink Floyd's Money or the song Take 5. So we've been talking about how to divide up time and how to play different notes like quarter notes, eighth notes, 16th notes, etc., etc. But one of the most important things when it comes to rhythm is actually where you're not playing. And that's what brings us to rests. rests are a way of indicating where you should not play in a piece of music. Now, you need to know what all the different rests look like, because for each note value or each subdivision value that we've talked about, there is a corresponding rest value. So we have whole rests, half rests, and quarter rests. And as you can see, the whole rest, it kind of looks like an upside down hat. The half rest looks like a hat that's right side up. The quarter rest kind of looks like a weird squiggly 3 kind of thing. It's really hard to draw if you're doing some handwritten stuff. And then finally, we have the 8th rest and the 16th rest. Now, the 8th rest and the 16th rest look almost identical to each other. And the 8th rest, it kind of looks like a little 7 with a dot at the end of it. And when we add an extra little flag sticking out, that gives us our 16th rest. And similarly to our 16th notes and our 8th notes, our 8th note has a little flag sticking out of it, and the 16th note has 2 flags sticking out of it. So whenever you see a rest, you do not play for the amount of time that's indicated by that rest. And you're going to see this all the time, so you really need to have that down. Okay, now we're moving on to dots and ties. Now, dots and ties can be really, really confusing for some people, but I'm gonna explain it to you in the simplest way I know how. A dot is simply something that you can add to any note that adds 50% of the value of that original note. So let's take a quarter note. A quarter note, like I said, in 4/4 time is 1 beat. And 2 eighth notes, if we split that quarter note into 2 parts, 2 eighth notes can fit in the space of that quarter note. So if we have a dotted quarter note, that note would actually span the length of 3 eighth notes. Because remember, an eighth is a half of a quarter, so we're adding half the value, or 50% of the value, to that original quarter note, which would give us a note that lasts for 3 eighth notes. Next, we have ties, and ties do a very similar job to dots, except that ties can essentially join any 2 rhythmic values together to create one long note that's held for a certain amount of time. So for example, we could take 2 quarter notes and tie them together, and actually it's the same thing as a half note, it's just written differently. Now, there's many different reasons why you might use ties, and I'll talk about that more in a second, but it's just very, very common to see different notes that are tied together so that we can hold them out for a very specific amount of time. For example, you might see like a half note tied to a dotted quarter note, which there is no other way to write that exact same rhythm. Here's a couple of examples of some rhythms that have dots and ties in them, and actually you're gonna see that a lot of rhythms that you write with dotted notes can be written out exactly the same way with ties, they just look different again. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3 E enda, 4 E enda. And the last thing I need to mention about dots and ties is something called the middle of the bar rule. So the middle of the bar rule is really important because it actually helps us read rhythms a lot easier. And the middle of the bar rule essentially means that we don't want to ever obfuscate the middle of any given bar of music. So when you have a bar 4/4 or a measure 4/4, you have beats 1 and 2 and then beats 3 and 4. You don't want to make it confusing as to where beat 2 ends and where beat 3 starts. So what this means is that you don't want to use, for example, a dotted quarter note that starts on beat 2 and have that written so it's bleeding into beat 3. Instead, if you wanted to write that rhythm, you would want to make it a quarter note tied to an eighth note so that you can still visually see that middle of the bar. It just makes things a lot easier to conceptualize and visualize when reading rhythm. So all of these different subdivisions that we've been doing are essentially divisions of 2 or 4, dividing a beat into 4 parts, or dividing a beat into 2 parts, or dividing a measure into 2 parts or 4 parts. But we're going to talk about something now called triplets. And a triplet is when we divide a beat or divide 2 beats or 4 beats or any number of beats into 3 equal parts. So for any one of the subdivisions that we've actually talked about so far, half notes, quarter notes, eighth notes, there is a triplet counterpart to that. So let's start with actually eighth notes. So we already know that 2 eighth notes fit into 1 beat. But if we wanted to make something called eighth note triplets, that would essentially be taking 1 beat and dividing that beat into 3 parts instead. So instead of counting the beats as 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, we would count them as triplet, 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 or 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. We can actually do the same thing with 16th notes. So in this space that 2 16th notes would normally take up, we can actually have 3 16th note triplets. And counting them would sound like this. Triplet, 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 triplet. As you can see, it's definitely a really fast subdivision, and it's only really possible to play it at relatively slow to medium tempo. There's also quarter note triplets, which is when we take the space of 2 quarter notes or 2 beats and we actually fit 3 evenly spaced notes in that space. And quarter note triplets can actually have sort of their whole own entire video dedicated to them, but I'll just give you an idea of how they sound. It actually creates this polyrhythm that is 3 to 2. So you have 3 evenly spaced notes over 2 evenly spaced notes. Quarter note triplets would be counted like this. 3, 4, triplet, triplet, Okay, so now you've learned about all the essential elements of rhythm, and I want to talk about a really, really important technique now that's going to help you to really understand all these rhythms and be able to read them quickly. Because it's one thing knowing how rhythm works, knowing how a subdivision would work, the rests, ties, and all that stuff, but it's another thing being able to look at a rhythm or hear a rhythm and know what it is and be able to play it really quickly. So the main strategy that you need to employ is something called rhythmic chunking. Now, what is rhythmic chunking? Rhythmic chunking is essentially being able to take a measure of music or 2 measures of music, just a group of rhythms, and be able to see beat by beat, or maybe even groups of 2 beats at a time, depending on what kind of subdivision it is, what rhythms are there, and be able to see them without having to actually count out each of the notes individually. So I want you to look at the example that just came up on the screen and see if you can identify within that measure of music all of the different beats that are in there. So you can see that the first beat is 2 16th notes and an eighth note. So that equals 1 beat. That's 1 rhythm that we can find in 1 beat. Then right after that, we have a quarter note. So that's its own beat right there. Then we have 2 eighth notes. That's a beat. And then finally, we have this dotted eighth 16th rhythm, which is 1 beat. So when you're looking at rhythms, you want to be able to essentially chunk up the measure like this. And that's going to help you to really, really get the rhythm down quickly. In this example, sounds like this. Let's do one more. This one has some rests in it. Now I want you to see if you can identify all of the 1 beat chunks that are in this measure. So you should see that the first beat is actually this 16th rest with a dotted eighth note right after that. That is the span of 4 16th notes, which is 1 beat. Then the next beat, beat 2, has a rest on the downbeat, and then it has an eighth note on the end of 2. So that's 1 beat there. And then finally, we have on beat 3, eighth note and 2 16th notes. And then beat 4 has a quarter note. So that group of the eighth and 2 16th is 1 beat. And then beat 4 is just a quarter note. So that's its own beat. And this is what this example sounds like. 1, 2, 3, 4. The last part of this video is going to be something that you really, really need to know as a guitar player, which is called rhythmic notation. If you notice, all the notes that I showed you in all the previous examples are essentially just regular notes that you would see on any piece of music. But there are specific note heads that are called rhythmic notation. And what this is used for is essentially to be able to give us chord symbols on top of a piece of music and then give us the rhythm underneath to play. So you don't have to write out the chord with all the different notes, and you don't really need to be able to read sheet music in order to play stuff that's written out like this. So check out this example that's on the screen here. As you can see, we essentially have one rhythm that repeats over and over, and it's a quarter note, 2/8 notes, another 2/8 notes, and a quarter note. And the way that this is counted is like this: 1, 2, and 3, and 4. 1, 2, and 3, and 4. So what this is telling us is that we need to keep playing this rhythm 1, 2, and 3, and 4, but we need to change the chords according to the chord symbol that is on top of the measure. So you can actually pick really any form of that chord that you want. So we have a D chord, then an A chord, and a G chord. You can play just your regular D, A, and G that you already know as an open chord, or if you know other different ways of playing D, A, and G, you can play those as well. Essentially, you can play any version of those chords you want as long as you're playing the correct rhythm. So playing this example would sound like this. Again, this is super simple to follow because all I'm doing is thinking about putting a D chord, an A chord, and G chord, just plugging it in and having that rhythm going over those chords or being played with those chords. So now that you know all the basics of reading almost any rhythm that you need to as a guitar player, the next thing that you need to start to check out is how to put different accents on the rhythms that you play, whether it's in your solos or your rhythmic guitar parts. So if you're interested in taking your rhythm to the even next level, check out this video on how to add accents into your guitar playing. Make sure you subscribe and go to jamsville.com right now. And until next time, listen, learn, and jam.